Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're tackling the recent protests that happened during Dutch Liberation Day, May 5th.
Right.
And we're using a YouTube video featuring Kees van der Peel as our guide here. He's a politicologist, someone who studies politics, basically.
And he pops up on Blackbacks quite a bit, known for being pretty critical of the West's stance on Israel and the situation in Gaza.
Exactly. So our mission really is to try and understand, what actually fueled these protests and what van der Peel's analysis tells us about them.
Yeah, and what jumps out immediately, I think, is that contrast. You've got this National Day of Celebration, Remembrance,
Yeah.
happening right alongside these very visible, very vocal protests. That tension, as van der Peel points out, it really signals that the issues in the Middle East are, well, they're significant enough to disrupt even these really deeply ingrained national events.
Absolutely. And there's another layer too, isn't there? The video mentions a speaker pointing out German soldiers in the parade.
For the first time on Liberation Day. Yeah.
Which, when you think about the history of that day, it really makes you pause, doesn't it? Makes you think about how alliances and maybe historical memory are shifting.
It really does. And sort of within that whole context commemoration, changing dynamics, the protests, at least in van der Peel's view, they force a pretty basic question on us all.
Which is,
Do we look away, when there's violence and suffering happening elsewhere?
yeah.
Or do we stand up, voice our concerns? That seems to be the core motivation he sees in the protesters.
The video also touches on how people initially reacted to the protests. Van der Peel makes this quite pointed comment about the defense minister, Ruben Breekmans.
Ah, yes, calling him a work student.
Working student, effectively. Playing the role of war minister is how he puts it. And he notes the minister seemed pretty unfazed while it was all kicking off. Okay, so let's really dig into van der Peel's view here. His critique of the events, the coverage. He clearly has some strong opinions.
Oh, definitely. One of the first things he makes clear is, well, his appreciation for the protesters actually doing something. He sees their action as important.
Right.
And that comparison, the work student one for the defense minister, that's quite loaded.
It suggests maybe a lack of seriousness or depth.
Exactly. A perceived lack of experience, maybe, or seriousness in these really quite powerful positions, especially when you're dealing with national defense.
Yeah.
He even suggests the minister's speech was almost like irrelevant, something you could just cross out.
Wow, that's certainly a take. Now, the video also talks about the police response, doesn't it, to the pro-Palestine protests. Van der Peel suggests it was pretty heavy-handed.
Yeah, he does. What's particularly notable is how he describes the tactics, mentioning the use of Romeos.
Those are the plainclothes officers, right?
That's right. Apparently using wooden sticks against protesters at the University of Amsterdam who were described as non-violent. He drawed a line from this back to the atmosphere during the COVID pandemic. He suggests it points to what he sees as a kind of breakdown in the social contract, that understanding between people and the government.
Where we give up some freedoms for protection, that idea.
Precisely. He feels those police actions undermine the trust inherent in that contract. He also mentions police being less identifiable, maybe in full gear, and these rumors in alternative media about foreign military acting as police.
Right, those kinds of stories circulate.
And he specifically mentions an incident involving someone called Oudmark being injured during a protest and the complications that followed.
So, serious concerns he's raising there about policing, about the state-citizen relationship. Okay, let's shift focus a bit to the actual disruption. The Liberation Day ceremonies themselves. This is often where people have strong feelings. Is it okay to disrupt something like that, especially with veterans there?
Yeah, that's the core of the debate, isn't it? Where do you draw the line with protest versus respect for commemoration? Van der Peel's stance is, well, pretty clear-cut.
He supports it.
He calls it a fantastic action. His argument seems to be that any action not part of the official plan, the official script, is a form of disruption anyway.
And his justification.
It comes down to the government's perceived inaction or even support, he implies, for what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza, while at the same time celebrating liberation from oppression here. He really stresses the protesters' motives, genuine concern, a need to do something about Gaza and Palestine.
So in his eyes, the disruption isn't just noise, it's a necessary wake-up call against what he sees as hypocrisy.
That seems to be his argument, yes. A challenge to a narrative he finds incomplete.
He also talks about this idea of a script and even floats the possibility, this Leo OP theory, let it happen on purpose.
Intriguing, isn't it?
Very. The idea that maybe the protests weren't entirely unexpected or even unwelcome by some in charge?
He expresses surprise, apparently, at how close the protesters got to the speakers. He contrasts it with the security after the Karstates attack, remember that?
I do. Much tighter security generally since then, you'd think.
Well, he acknowledges, obviously, a banner isn't a car. But then he sort of dismisses the idea that security was actually tighter for this event. Says a banner is easy to hide.
So he's skeptical about the security claims.
It seems so. He suggests there's no real proof of these enhanced measures being properly in place,
Hmm.
which, leads to that question. Could a bit of controlled disruption actually serve someone's agenda? Maybe shape the story or distract?
Interesting point about security and maybe, just maybe, a degree of allowing things to happen. Now, the timing, that also seems important, especially when you look at other things happening in the Netherlands.
Vanderpeel definitely brings that up.
Huh.
He mentions Marco Kroon's book, Parrot Ready, which is supposedly about getting the Dutch population ready for war.
Ah, right.
And he suggests, maybe it's just coincidence, but maybe the protests actually help promote that book's message by creating this sense of unease or urgency about being prepared.
An indirect boost, perhaps?
Perhaps. He also looks back at his own student days, remembers disrupting university ceremonies back then.
And sees a parallel.
He seems to think those past actions were justified. And these current protests are too. Given what he sees as government failures on major issues, he's particularly critical, very strong words, about the defense minister's pro-war talk and the government sending weapons to Israel, which he explicitly accuses of genocide, and also to Ukraine, which he thinks just prolongs that war.
So he's connecting the dots, seeing these protests as part of a much bigger critique of Dutch foreign and military policy. It's not just about Gaza for him.
Exactly. It's a wider challenge to the current direction.
Now, Vanderpeel clearly sympathizes with the protesters. We should probably acknowledge other ways of looking at this, too.
Absolutely. It's important. Even understanding his viewpoint, you can also see why some people, regardless of their views on Gaza, would question disrupting a national day like this.
Yeah,
Especially with veterans present. That resonates with many.
of course.
But flipping it back to the protesters' perspective, as we sort of touched on, the timing could be seen as very strategic.
To maximize attention.
Right. Draw attention to Gaza precisely when the official story is about unity, peace, liberation. And, well, it clearly worked in terms of generating discussion. We're talking about it now.
It certainly did spark conversation. And a big part of Vanderpeel's analysis also seems to be this deep distrust of how the mainstream media covered it all.
Yeah, he's worried the media might paint figures like Marco Kroon as heroes while making the protesters look bad.
A common critique that media narratives can be biased.
He argues that mainstream outlets often back military actions and basically act as propaganda for Western governments. Look, it's critique you hear from different parts of the political spectrum, that questioning of mainstream narratives.
It does speak to a wider sense of frustration in society, doesn't it? That feeling some people have that their views aren't being heard or being actively ignored.
Precisely.
Mm.
Vanderpeel taps into that underlying frustration of people who just don't agree with the dominant story. He knows this trend, disrupting solemn events like Remembrance Day, Liberation Day, seems to be becoming more common.
He mentioned the smoke bomb too, right? Though apparently it wasn't very smoky.
He did. But ultimately, it comes down to differing opinions on whether these disruptions are acceptable, especially, perhaps, given the specific message the defense minister was delivering at the time.
And for Vanderpeel, the deeper reasons behind the protest boil down to feeling ignored, feeling desperate.
It seems so. A sense that normal channels aren't working, maybe. And this fundamental clash with what he calls the Western regime and its support for wars. He even mentions action handbooks, like Extinction Rebellion uses.
Suggesting it's also about strategy, getting media attention.
Yeah, the gaining attention, forcing the issue into the public eye is a key motivator for these kinds of disruptive tactics.
Which leads us quite neatly, actually, to Kees Vanderpeel's book, Toen Marx nog in de mode was.
When Marx was still in fashion, yeah.
He calls it a documentary, but also sort of ironic, looking at universities' international conferences, mainly between 74 and 92.
It sounds like a snapshot of a very different time, intellectually and politically.
He paints this picture where Marxist ideas were much more common in universities, leading to this, well, he calls it a creative burst. Even with some of the, rigid dogma that sometimes came with it.
He shares stories.
Yeah, like students being asked if they were Marxist to join clubs, shows how mainstream it was then. But he also remembers a real spirit of working together, students being really active and engaged.
And the backdrop to all this.
He describes the 70s as really unstable internationally, crises in the UK, France, this feeling that big changes were coming.
A sense of possibility, maybe?
Perhaps. Then he contrasts that with later years, this creeping managerial culture in universities, academic conferences changing their feel. He even talks about discovering a CIA agent in their department,
Seriously, what were they doing?
monitoring potential communist influence, apparently, collecting papers, that sort of thing. Wow, so a time of intense engagement, but also maybe underlying tensions, a big contrast to now, he seems to suggest.
He implies that his book explores the early signs of things we see today, like authoritarian leanings, silencing dissent, certain taboos, even early woke culture ideas showing up in the 80s,
He gives an example, doesn't he, about someone appointed to handle complaints about unwanted intimacy.
who was rumored to be guilty of it themselves.
Yeah.
He contrasts that with what he felt was more equality, more openness earlier on.
So why write the book now? What's his main motivation?
It really seems to be about setting the record straight. He feels that period has been misrepresented, especially by people who were leftists back then but are now, pro-NATO, pro-capitalism.
So it's not like, let's go back to the 70s.
No, he says that's impossible. It's supposed like he wants to revisit a time he saw as having more intellectual freedom, fewer taboos. He wants to show that a genuine progressive movement existed, and he thinks it was deliberately undermined over time.
Undermine how? He mentions the CIA again, doesn't he, in relation to the hippie movement.
Yeah, he touches on theories about the CIA actively working against the hippie movement, seeing its values, freedom, love, as a threat to the established order. He even mentions figures like Charles Manson in that context, potentially used to discredit the counterculture.
So connecting historical analysis to current events, seeing patterns of challenging authority and how that's dealt with.
Exactly. He talks about humanity swinging between states of fear and love. The hippie era, for him, was his rise of love, which threatened the power structures that rely on fear.
And the powers that be tried to break it.
That's his interpretation. Break apart the love movement. He even draws a comparison between the cultural impact of the hippies' long hair, beards becoming normal, and maybe the current LGBT movement,
How so?
suggesting both represent a push for more freedom, breaking away from rigid norms. He emphasizes how much society changed in the 60s, 70s, 80s women's rights, moving away from the conservative 50s, often driven by relatively small groups.
He also thinks people were more willing to speak out back then.
Yeah, he points to the peace movement, the CIA collecting academic papers, people were engaged, maybe less afraid to voice opinions, even if monitored. He brings up the assassination of Olof Palme.
The Swedish prime minister.
Right, shortly after he agreed with Gorbachev on nuclear disarmament. Highlights a really dangerous political climate. Vanderpeel says he went to a memorial for Palme later and was disappointed by the lack of serious engagement, felt political commitment had faded.
So the book is his way of holding on to his perspective, his truth, in a world he sees as having changed a lot.
Seems that way. He calls it an honest book, mentions he had a good experience with the publisher too.
Yeah.
And for anyone interested, it's out there in bookstores and online.
And he ends on a slightly hopeful note, despite everything.
Yeah, it says 2025 is still a good year to be alive. Also mentions he's 77, but keeping active helps.
Good for him. So what's really interesting here is how he connects the dots, right? His historical look at the 70s and 80s isn't just nostalgia.
Not at all. He's weaving it into his understanding of today. He sees this recurring tension, established power versus movements challenging the norms, whether it was Marxism back then or these protests now.
Okay, so let's try and pull this together. Our deep dive, using Vanderpeel's analysis, points to this real dissatisfaction with government policy, especially on Gaza, arms sales.
Right. And he sees the Liberation Day protests not just as acceptable, but maybe even necessary disruptions, challenging a national story he finds lacking.
And his book, When Marx Was Still in Fashion, gives this broader context, thinking about how societies change, how dissent is handled, that ongoing push-pull between authority and those wanting change.
Absolutely. If you take his work as a whole, his commentary now, his look back then, it's really an encouragement to question official stories, isn't it? To look for other perspectives.
The protests in his framework are just the latest chapter in this long history of pushing back against things people see as unjust, trying to make sure different voices get heard.
Makes sense.
So here's a final thought, something for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. We've talked about this tension, protest versus tradition. How do different people, different generations, different groups today actually understand freedom? What does it mean, and how should it be expressed?
Good question.
And maybe more pointedly, how much does knowing history like the kind Vanderpeel digs into help us grasp why social movements happen today and what they really signify? Something to think about after this deep dive wraps up.